Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan, His Life and Times by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 5 Apprenticeship to Power, 1958 to 1963. The Soviet Union's premier, Nikita Khrushchev, had come to the UN that September, and Zulfi raised with him the possibility of a Russo-Pakistani joint venture in oil exploration in Balochistan. Oil Hunt had just abandoned its interest in the region. Khrushchev was sufficiently intrigued by so bold a proposition from a US ally as to send a delegation of experts to Pakistan in September 1960 to explore oil potential along the Makran coast. The Soviet team recommended exploration of the potentially rich region, for which the Soviet government would float a long-term loan. In December 1960, Bhutto led a delegation to Moscow to negotiate the agreement. Zulfi opened a second diplomatic front in 1959 when before the Political Committee of the UN. He delivered a short, strong statement in support of the people of Algeria against French imperialism. It was Pakistan's first open stand on the important pan-Islamic issue, one that was to remain near the top of Zulfi's foreign policy agenda. He was not yet foreign minister, but he took bold initiatives that he hoped would meet with approval from his field marshal president in Pindi, Punjab's army general headquarters, to which Pakistan's capital had been moved on the first anniversary of Ayoub's revolution. The Algerian question was still under discussion. Zulfi told his Karachi businessman audience, "On this question and on Kashmir, I shall report my views to the President and Foreign Minister." Thanks to his initiative on the matter, Pakistan recognized the Provisional Government of Algeria, building the first of several important pan-Islamic bridges across North Africa that Bhutto always kept in good repair. From the birth of Pakistan, Kashmir had been a primary source of conflict with India. The princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, with 3/4 of its population Muslim, had more reason to expect to join the new Muslim nation of Pakistan in August 1947 than to be integrated into the Indian Dominion. Kashmir's Maharaja Hari Singh was, however, Hindu and at first tried to keep his state independent of both his larger neighbors. But in early October 1947, Pathan tribal volunteers had invaded Kashmir in British lorries, and as they approached Srinagar, Maharaja Hari Singh fled and opted to join India. The first undeclared war had broken out and would continue to shroud Kashmir's lovely vale in smoke and fighting for more than a year. A UN ceasefire agreement was effected at the start of 1949. Governor General Jinnah had tried in vain to hurl Pakistan's entire army against the airborne Indian troops flown into Srinagar from Delhi on Governor General Mountbatten's orders. But British officers were still in command of both new Dominion's armies, and Pakistan's commander-in-chief refused absolutely to launch his force against troops under Mountbatten's commands. Jinnah felt treacherously betrayed and authorized the expanded invasion by volunteer forces, but they proved less effective than Indian army. Mountbatten and Nehru both promised Pakistan, however, that India would accept the choice of Kashmiri people as to their future in a fair and impartial plebiscite after all fighting had stopped and all invading forces were withdrawn. No plebiscite has ever been taken in Kashmir as a whole. Pakistan refused to order unilateral withdrawal of its volunteers as long as Indian troops remained inside the Vale to intimidate Kashmiris. The UN ceasefire line became a de facto border between the western third of the frontier unitary state of Jammu and Kashmir, called Azad Free Kashmir by Pakistan, and the rest of the state, including the capital of Srinagar and its well, called Jammu and Kashmir, now a state within India. The UN subsequently sent several of its best mediators to try to resolve the plebiscite deadlock, but to no avail. A token UN force of monitors remains at checkpoints along the ceasefire line, Yet, sporadic firings and night crossings continue everywhere along the border, wound which has refused to heal. In 1959, China was constructing a road through Ladakh's Aksai Chin that would link its western new province of Xinjiang to Tibet. India insisted that Ladakh, Kashmir's northeast region, was entirely Indian territory, a position China disputed. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru warned Chow Enlai not to underestimate India's firm resolve to defend its integrity against any invasion, including one from China, with whom Nehru had once hoped to forge a third world pan-Asian alliance based on 5 principles, which began with mutual respect and ended in self-determination. Zulfi's sharp political mind recognized this simmering conflict between India and China as a major source of potential diplomatic advantage for Pakistan if properly exploited. He was acutely conscious of how swiftly great powers shift alliances, of how winds of diplomatic change move faster the higher their altitude, till jet speeds become possible at the summits. He had the foresight to envision possible advantages to Pakistan, therefore, in seeking ties not only with the Soviets and Northern Africa's Islamic nation, but also with China. His enemy's enemy was, he knew, always a potential friend. Zulfi wrote Ayub shortly before leaving the UN General Assembly to say that for the past several weeks he had been anxiously concerned with the India-China situation in Ladakh and the impact it would have on our position regarding Kashmir. He had noticed in the press that when Ayub was asked a question regarding Ladakh during an airport interview, he had replied to the effect that it was India's problem. Zulfi was careful to write that though he wasn't sure of Ayub's exact wording or whether it was accurately reported, India and its friends might construe and probably use such a statement in future negotiations against Pakistan. We can be taken to have tacitly recognized India's authority over that part of Kashmir, which he controls at present. After all, it is by virtue of the present partition of Kashmir that India controls Ladakh and is in a position to declare that China's encroachment on Ladakh is an encroachment on India itself. Zulfi argued, adding that should Ayub's statement be left to stand, we can be deemed to be stopped from saying in future that the responsibility for the preservation of the territory of Jammu and Kashmir is not that of India, but of the Security Council. Pakistan had, after all, insisted that Jammu and Kashmir was not Indian territory and that, therefore, its external defense was a matter of Security Council alone to consider. Ayub's remark made an immediate authoritative pronouncement necessary to safeguard Pakistan's consistent position on Kashmir. The pronouncement would not embroil us with China, but could, on the contrary, be welcomed in Peking as a statement from Pakistan questioning the very basis of India's stand on Ladakh. Neither Ayub nor the preoccupied Foreign Minister Kadir had been sharp enough to grasp what Zulfi appreciated the moment he read the newspaper report, which had in fact been quite accurate. Ayub had other things uppermost in his mind and was never as adroit in handling reporters' questions as was his youngest minister. He preferred giving orders. Then too, Ayub had been focusing on his prolonged and vital Indus Canal waters negotiations with Nehru, which were far more essential to Pakistan's survival than Kashmir because the headwaters of the Indus and Punjab rivers were under Indian control. Talks with the World Bank and Nehru were at a crucial state. The almost concluded treaty could ensure Pakistan of 80% of the total flow of Indus waters for its canals and more than $740 million from the World Bank to build the huge Mangla, Tarbela and Rohtas dams. Zulfi was aware of the importance of those negotiations and assured Ayub that the effect any statement on Kashmir might have upon them would have to be carefully considered. Still, we cannot let India damage our entire position on Kashmir during the time these negotiations remain pending. Zulfi's solution was to make a statement, unhostile in tone and confined only to principle. He enclosed a copy of his letter to Ayub in a letter to Foreign Minister Kadir and explained his feeling that we shall have to examine the whole question in depth and not let the India-China situation regarding Kashmir drift and develop to our detriment. Zulfi thus prepared the ground for a meeting with Ayub and Kadir in early December, impressing them both in advance with his diplomatic sensitivities, global awareness, and shrewd strategic planning. In April of 1960, he was appointed Minister for Kashmir Affairs. Ayub turning over the portfolio held until then by himself. Zulfi retained control over the ministries of National Construction and Information, was also given fuel, power and natural resources and put in charge of Pakistan's projects divisions, but relinquished commerce. Still the youngest member of the cabinet, he was no longer its most junior. Now he had Ayub's ear and full confidence, for the Field Marshal had learned at Sandhurst to recognize a first-rate mind when he encountered one, and Bhutto could be a charmer as well. Zulfi later asserted that he had noticed certain appalling weaknesses in Ayub within a year of his assumption of the presidential office, but had remained attached to him because, by Shakespearean logic, the one who lives by honest dreams must choose the bad amongst the worst. Ayub's insatiable greed was what had disillusioned him about Ayub, though their breaking point did not come until after the 1965 war with India over Kashmir. Ayub's tall, dignified stature and military self-assured manner served him much the way that the same qualities had served President Dwight Eisenhower. Each was widely admired and supported at home and abroad. Vice President Lyndon Johnson, for example, found Ayub forceful and capable and was deeply impressed with him and the progress made under his dependable leadership. That assessment was conveyed to President Kennedy in 1961 and ensured more aid for Pakistan. Zulfi was willing to wait and work under the Field Marshal's wing, patiently accepting Ayub's leadership till Pakistan would be ready for the best, which he alone, he believed, could offer. Minister Bhutto again led the Pakistan delegation to UN in 1960, when for the first time he broke ranks with the US position on the People's Republic of China, abstaining rather than voting against Peking's membership in the World Forum. Washington wired its dissatisfaction to Foreign Minister Kadir, who then wired Zulfi, retracting his discretionary powers on future UN votes. Zulfi never liked Kadir and was hardly one to take orders from a colleague he considered inferior to himself, intellectually as well as socially. I feel that the time has come for Pakistan to adopt an attitude in the United Nations more consistent with its recognition of the Peking regime than has been the case since 1954. Zulfi wired home in October 1960, little more than 2 years before he would take charge of Pakistan's foreign ministry. He bolstered his China argument by noting how important it was to strengthen our position among Third World Asian Africans. His hope was to forge a Third World alliance under Pakistan's leadership, the strategic dream of his larger global vision. He viewed Sino-Pakistani friendship not only as a counter to Indian hegemony in South Asia, but as one part of his blueprint for an Afro-Asian third force, a superpower equal to either the United States or USSR. The foreign ministry remained wedded to US policy. However, the CENTO and CETO alliances, Kadir feared that Afro-Asian neutrality would eventuate in Nehruvian Indian leadership. In Ayub's cabinet, Zulfi alone had the vision to recognize the global appeal of neutralism as a political philosophy. After returning from New York, Zulfi forcefully argued in the cabinet on 18th November 1960 that the time had come for Pakistan to shift toward the Soviet Union and China, voting for admission of the PRC at the next session of the UN and the opening of direct negotiations with the Soviets on a broad economic agenda. Kadir vetoed the suggested stance on China, but just a month after that meeting, Bhutto led Pakistan's first official delegation to Moscow. There was no direct flight to Soviet Union from Pakistan, so Zulfi was obliged first to fly to New Delhi on 13th December 1960, where he and his delegation had to wait 3 nights at the Pakistan embassy before a plane took off for Tashkent on 16th December. Bad weather over that Central Asian city, which was to host Indo-Pakistani peace talks half a decade later, forced a landing at Samarkand, birthplace of the founder of South Asia's great Mughal empire, Babur. The grandeur of Islamic architecture and culture, so richly visible in this citadel of the great Temur and his descendants, made one feel proud to be part of its history, race, and religion. Zulfi wrote, feeling renewed pride in his Islamic heritage. They drove the next day from Samarkand to Tashkent, where the delegation was warmly welcomed and prayed at the famous Jamia Masjid. Zulfi flew to Moscow on 19th December and entered the Kremlin the next day for final oil contract negotiations. The sessions concluded New Year's Eve with a party hosted by Khrushchev, who was in great form and proposed a number of toasts, all of which Zulfi drank. The first Soviet-Pakistani agreement released 120 million rubles of credit to Pakistan over a 12-year period. A team of Soviet explorers, engineers, and scientists soon arrived to search the sands of Balochistan and Sindh, where they found a rich field of gas but no oil. By the eve of his 33rd birthday, Zulfi Bhutto had become Pakistan's second most experienced advisor to Ayub Khan on foreign affairs, crossing verbal swords with Foreign Minister Kadir in more than one cabinet meeting, yet always remaining loyal to the team of cabinet government. He said just enough to make Ayub think that if ever a younger spokesman were needed, he was ready to take on that challenge. His UN experience had, moreover, helped Bhutto to focus his global vision more sharply, convincing him that in a world dominated by the great powers and filled with fear of a nuclear holocaust, the umbrella of a world organization was the best protector of smaller, non-nuclear states. By 1961, Zulfi was hopeful that Algeria would soon take its place in the UN after 7 years of war against colonial France, informing his friends in Karachi that when it did, inshallah, a tragic chapter will close in history. Kashmir remained at the top of his South Asian foreign policy agenda, however. Only when that dispute was resolved, Zulfi argued, would peace and progress come to the subcontinent. The following year, speaking to the graduates of Sindh University, Zulfi described India's forcible occupation of Kashmir as a grave threat to peace. He condemned Indian aggression in attempting to stop the march of the people of Kashmir towards their goal of self-determination and asserted that Kashmir's fraudulent accession to India was the greatest corrupting influence on the ethics of international relations. Self-determination is the God-given right of Kashmir's people, Zulfi argued, concluding that there can be no peace without the solution of Kashmir problem. Neither Ayub nor Kadir had ever used such strong language in public pronouncements on Kashmir. Ayub, of course, knew the precarious nature of his rule and appreciated better than Zulfi that in military thinking, the crucial factor was capability. Pakistan's moral and legal claims to Kashmir were certainly more persuasive than India's, but India's military capability remained far greater, which helps perhaps to explain Ayub's caution about using language as inflammatory as that of his young advisor. Ayub had come to enjoy his position as president and rather liked the idea of continuing to rule a peaceful Pakistan, whose new capital, Islamabad, was daily growing. Even as its basic democracy constitution was finally being born in midsummer of 1962. A constitution commission appointed by Ayub early in 1960 had finished its work in 2 years. That year, the National Assembly met for the first time since Ayub's 1958 revolution. Zulfi was one of Ayub's closest advisors on the constitution and how best to manage Pakistan's transition from autocratic military rule to democratic government, with at least some patina of popular political support. As Minister for Basic Democracies, Zulfi helped prepare the ground for Ayub's first election. 80,000 martially loyal basic Democrats had been chosen to represent some 90 million Pakistanis by an elaborate 5-tier process of indirect screening completed in January of 1960. More than 75,000 of those basic Democrats voted yes on the question of whether they had confidence in President Ayub Khan. Fewer than 3,000 no votes were cast in that intimidating referendum, which Ayub hailed as a national election. Elections to provincial and national assemblies were held in the spring of 1962, with only the basic Democrats enfranchised. All candidates ran as partyless independents for those high legislative offices. Zulfi ran for the National Assembly from Larkana, where one Abdul Fateh Mehman had the temerity to file nomination papers contesting the constituency. After a week, Mehman wisely withdrew. Having thus gotten himself elected unopposed, Zulfi decided to campaign for some of his like-minded friends in Sindh, primarily Yusuf Chandio in Thatta, Ghulam Meher in Sakhar, and Ghulam Mustafa Jatoi, who ran for the National Assembly from Nawabshah. He, Jatoi, was at the railway station to meet me with many of his friends. Zulfi remembered, flattered at finding Jatoi himself coming into his private railway saloon, followed by food enough for an army, including the delicious Jatoi minced chicken. Zulfi had planned to get down at Nawabshah to make a public pitch for his friend, but Jatoi insisted that he must be very tired and was so considerate about his needs that Zulfi was brought around to think that simply by stopping at the station, he had done more than enough to boost Jatoi's campaign. Years later, Zulfi learned from Pir Pagado, leader of Sindh's populous and powerful tribes of Hurs, that the Pir had just then given Jatoi an ultimatum. If Bhutto Sahab so much as stepped down in Nawabshah to campaign for Jatoi, Jatoi would lose the Pir's support. Jatoi's clever strategy had kept both Bhutto and Pir Pagado on his side, ensuring his unopposed election. When the assembly convened, Jatoi and Zulfi became intimate political allies. Jatoi introduced Zulfi to another landlord member elected to that assembly from Punjab's Muzaffargarh district, then a singularly shy, handsome young man named Ghulam Mustafa Khar. Some 150 odd members of the new National Assembly met on 8th June 1962 when martial law was declared to be ended. But Pakistan's most popular old political leaders were not there, either having been jailed or disqualified by Ayub's martial law elective body's disqualification order. Former Prime Minister Suharwardi had been arrested on 30th January and thereby prevented from winning his seat, triggering student riots that started in Dhaka and soon spread all across East Pakistan. That 21st February was the 10th anniversary of Dhaka's Martyrs' Day, and before the next decade was over, thousands of new Bengali martyrs would be born. Minister Bhutto urged Ayub to reintroduce political parties, and the president finally agreed, taking the faded mantle of the old Muslim League as his party in support of his government's political parties bill, which continued to exclude all those earlier disqualified from election under martial law acts, such as the Elective Bodies Disqualification Order. Bhutto spoke eloquently in the assembly on 10th July 1962. The role of a political party is essential to every state. If democracy is to flourish, you must have respect for the other man's point of view. Sir, why was Pakistan created? Why did millions of people give their lives for the creation of our state? The fountainhead of our way of life was to be democratic way of life. But unfortunately, soon after the creation of Pakistan, we lost our great and beloved leader, the Qaid-e-Azam, and soon after his death, we lost the Qaid-e-Millat. Therefore, sir, the political history of this country went through such turmoil that in October 1958, the revolution had to come to try and put the state of affairs in order. His apologia for martial law went on to blame pre-Ayyub politicians like Sohrawardi, who played havoc and ran amok with the destinies of the people, and therefore deserved to be debarred from polluting the social and economic life of the nation. Zulfi insisted that during the pre-martial law local elections, the whole machinery of the police and the bureaucracy were geared up to stifle freedom of thought, freedom of expression. To practice dictatorship in a democracy is worst form of evil against society. And that is exactly how we were functioning before the present constitution. Zulfi repeated his warnings against the democracy of dictators. Sir, we suffered and continue to suffer from the petty-mindedness or feudal rivalry in our province, Sindh. I too am a part of that society. Perhaps one reason why I am here today as a minister is because I belong to this privileged class. Therefore, I do admit the advantages of the system, but it has many inherent drawbacks. It leads to petty intrigues. It leads to victimization of the people, to callousness towards poverty, to lethargy. So when feudal rivals clashed, there was no development, no factories, no roads. Absolute darkness and miserable poverty prevailed. Only the chosen few prospered. But now, democracy is our creed. Without democracy, Pakistan cannot progress. Then he cautioned, by a process of democracy, a coterie of dictatorship has been imposed time and time again. One must protect and safeguard through institutions, through democratic measures, the indirect and backdoor methods of stifling the people's will. People who believe in a totalitarian system impose a dictatorship by using democratic methods. Then came a warning against what one day would become Zulfi's own means of retaining power. We know, sir, how demagogues have taken issues of the people. We know, without ever believing in issues or in principles, people have tried to say that a certain issue is their religion. We have known how manifestos have been drafted for political purposes with no intention of fulfillment. It is ironical that elections were held for the first time when martial law was imposed in the country. No general elections were held before. Under the old constitution, the poor individual who had the courage to file a nomination paper was hurled into a car and thrown into the desert. When after a day or two he returned, he inquired from the successful chief minister if there was no law and order in the land. The chief minister replied that in his realm there was no law but only order, and that was his order. In August of 1962, Zulfi flew with Ayyub to Lahore, Karachi, Quetta and Pindi, speaking from every platform and at every party meeting with his president. He was becoming Ayyub's foremost advisor in political matters as well as foreign affairs. Zulfi's brilliant eloquence was a great asset to Ayyub, who never liked long speeches or politicking of any kind. He felt fortunate to have a young man at his side, an Oxford man of good family one could trust, a man who could argue forcefully with the loudest and harshest of Pakistani students and other so-called intellectuals. The aging president began to feel positively paternal towards his youngest minister and may well have considered him a possible heir to his political throne, not immediately, but in another decade or so. If Bhutto mellowed with maturity, Ayub knew, of course, about Zulfi's passions and heady taste. Every man's man enjoyed lovely women as the field marshal himself did. Every soldier worth his salt liked strong drink. But Ayub had always been most discreet in his private affairs. Zulfi had met a woman in 1969 for whom he cast all discretion to the winds, though he had, in truth, never been known before that to inhibit his passions. This Black Beauty, as she was called by his closest friends, had a powerful impact on Zulfi. She was married when they met to a Dhaka lawyer, Abdul Ahad, a friend of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Destined to be one of the first Dhaka intellectuals slaughtered by West Pakistani troops when the Bangladesh struggle for independence began in 1971. Husna Sheikh was born and brought up in Calcutta during the 1930s, though she herself was not Bengali, her father having come there for work from Haripur on the northwest frontier. Still a woman of charm and vivacity in her 50s, Husna must have been ravishing when Zulfi first met her in full glow of voluptuous young motherhood. But it was not simply her physical charms that hypnotized him. She was the first woman Zulfi ever loved, except for Benazir, who could think about and talk about politics much the way he did, never tiring of a subject most Pakistani women considered men's business. The first night they met in Dhaka at a large party, they found a place to sit quite alone where they drank and talked politics till 4 o'clock in the morning, which surprised them both. He was a brilliant man, Husna recalled. She wanted to do many things and had an intuition that he didn't have enough time. Mostly, whenever we were together by ourselves, we would discuss politics. Zulfi flew to Dhaka as often as he possibly could, and before year's end, Nusrat knew, of course, that something had possessed him. She challenged him. Zulfi not only confessed his new love, but bragged of it, extolling the brilliance of his dusky new beauty. As mother of his 4 children, and still no negligible beauty herself, Begum Nusrat refused to be shunned aside and remained silent as his village cousin bride had done without cry or whimper. But all her tears and pleas proved unavailing because Husna's potent appeal was not simply physical but also cerebral. She pandered to Zulfi's not inconsiderable ego. Whenever they discussed politics and world affairs, after the urgent flames of passion died down, for she understood politics almost as well as he did. And she flattered him without seeming to flatter, even as she sated him without tiring herself, stimulating his mind, body, and spirit, rousing him to the peaks of excitement he had never known, awaking powers left so long to rusticate back home. He had thought them almost moribund. Dhaka, with Husna beside him, was now to Karachi what Karachi had been to Larkana when first he met Nusrat and danced close to her, what Berkeley had once briefly been with Caroline. Nusrat had been as clever as Husna was now, in teasing him, catering to his ego, ensnaring his romantic spirit, exciting his passionate dreams and desires with every smile, wink, taunt, or defiant toss of her head. For Zulfi's proud, vain, arrogant, insecure, clever, scheming, easily bored, spoiled psyche, nothing was as comforting as a beautiful woman who devoted herself fully to his needs, desires, and dreams, rousing his hopes and calming his darkest fears, as his own mother once had. There was once he fell in love, Begum Nusrat recalled tearfully. He had an affair with, but the name was too painful to utter aloud. Another person. He used to come and tell me about it and apologize and say he didn't know what happened to him. And I said I didn't want to stay with him. Nusrat, whose Persian name means victory, soon found that neither tears nor righteous indignation lured him back from the satisfaction, physical, mental, maternal, political, he had found in Dhaka. He had to be best in everything, Husna smilingly remembered, the world's best lover as well as leader, and he was. Husna's telling him that he was seems for a while to have sufficed to keep Zulfi so enamored and magnetized by his black beauty that in 1962 he actually threw out Begum Nusrat after one of their harsher fights over his constant infidelity. We were in Pindi, in a flashman's hotel. Ardeshir Kawasji, heir to Pakistan's first Parsi shipping empire, then still a friend of Nusrat and Zulfi's, recalled. Begum Nusrat had walked over from Mrs. Davies' hotel to cry, "Zulfi has thrown me out," and asked Ardeshir and his wife Nancy for help in getting her to Ayub Khan or to his Begum. Nancy and Ayub's daughter were very close friends, so the president's house car was soon sent around to drive Nancy and Nusrat to Government House to see Begum Ayub. Nancy recalled how Nusrat tearfully recounted that she had been thrown out of her own home by her faithless husband, bag and baggage. Before the day ended, Zulfi was called on the carpet by Ayub Khan and ordered to take his good wife back or quit the cabinet. Zulfi acquiesced, but the next day he marched up to Ardeshir, whom he had once fondly addressed as Tipu Sultan, hissing with rage, "I'll never forgive you for this." Nor did he ever forgive Ayub either. Zulfi's memory was as long as his temper was hot. Ayub, however, quickly forgave Zulfi, as a good general must forgive those who accept his orders and surrender to his superior force. He might have appointed Zulfi foreign minister a bit earlier had it not been for the flap over Nusrat, because Manzoor Kadir, weak and tired, had stepped down before the end of 1962. Ayub chose, however, to appoint Muhammad Ali Bogra, who was still in Washington and could easily be deputed to New York as foreign minister, his last official assignment. In January of 1963, Bogra suffered a fatal heart attack and Ayub gave Zulfi the chance he'd been waiting for, itching for almost all of his adult life. It was quite a birthday present, promotion to foreign minister at only 35. Zulfi was then old enough to qualify for presidency under the terms of Ayub Khan's 1962 constitution. He considered himself much better qualified for the job than its incumbent, but would wait a few years longer before making his move to displace Ayub.